Muy bien. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid those of you who don't speak English will need your headphones. Hello, Elisa. How are you? Okay, so we're going to start this session. As you know, this is extremely timely because His Majesty the King, Felipe VI, has started his consultations with the 14 political representatives whom he will be seeing between today and Thursday afternoon. And hopefully, after this first round of talks, or hopefully this in fact will be the first and last and only round of talks, someone will have the courage to step forward and try to form a government, unlike what happened back in December. Spain is now rapidly catching up with Belgium, competing for the not terribly privileged or glamorous role of the country which has gone longest without a government. So we had elections, as you know, on the 20th of December last year, and then elections again on the 26th of June. And I think only Belgium has been without a government longer than Spain, at least in the recent past. Another point to keep in mind, by the way, is that together with Malta, Spain is the only country in the European Union which has never had a coalition government. And I think this is important because it tells you a lot about Spain's majoritarian political culture. And this may also explain why political leaders are finding it so difficult to form a government as we speak. So we are very fortunate today to have two speakers who've been kind enough to come to Santander. One of them from The Hague, the other from London. And our first speaker was in Madrid a few months ago in the wake of the first elections. Herman Willink, who is the former president of the Senate of the Netherlands and the former vice president of the Council of State. We have distributed a number of his publications, and I hope you will read them because they are extremely interesting, and they are also available on our Remco website. So if you lose your copies, do not panic. You can download them from our website. And he is extremely interesting for the purpose of this conversation that we're going to have today because he played a very prominent role in the formation of several Dutch governments. So he is going to talk about why the Netherlands thought that it would be a good idea to create specific institutional mechanisms to facilitate the formation of governments in a context, in a political culture which is not at all majoritarian and which is extremely accustomed to coalition governments. We are also very fortunate and pleased to have with us Professor Robert Blackburn from King's College London. My brother and father attended UCL, but I won't hold it against you. And he is a very prominent and distinguished expert on the British Constitution, British political system, and he is currently in the process of creating an institute or a research unit to deal with precisely the study of the role of the monarchy. We have also included a very interesting recent article of his entitled Queen Elizabeth II and the Evolution of the Monarchy, which has always also been distributed. So we're very fortunate to have him and his wife Paula with us. Thank you very much, both of you, for coming. It's a great honor and a pleasure to have you with us. So without further ado, Herman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you for the invitation to this summer course. Before I say anything on the topic assigned to me, the Crown in the government formation process of the Netherlands, I should like to offer some observations on the subject of this summer course. It's one that appears more straightforward than it actually is. European monarchies differ in terms of their history and their constitutional traditions. The word politics and
Alejarlo un poquito. O apagarlo mejor.
The words politics and democracy are interpreted in different ways. And what should we understand by Europe? If I may, I should like to address these points from a Dutch perspective and raise some questions that I believe that are relevant to our discussion. And I do so because yesterday I noticed that the transition period in Spain is still an important argument in the defense of the monarchy. But there are other arguments, even important, for the role of the monarchy, for the king nowadays and in the future. One important feature of European constitutional monarchies is that sovereignty is based on two foundations. One is popular sovereignty, enshrined implicitly in the Constitution and represented by Parliament. And the other is the monarch, who represents the sovereignty of the state. If one of these foundations, popular sovereignty, starts to crumble, the second grows in importance, but then it too becomes increasingly vulnerable. This has been the case for the last few years, if not decades. Paradoxically, therefore, if you want to preserve and strengthen a constitutional democracy, you would be well advised to protect the institution of a constitutional monarchy. But how does constitutional monarchy relate to democracy and politics? Some remarks on both monarchy and democracy. One point is often overlooked in discussions about monarchy in a constitutional democracy. Democracy as such is more than political democracy, and political democracy amounts to more than periodic elections resulting in decisions taken by the democratically elected majority. Since the king is not elected, he should have no place in a constitutional democracy. But such a theory does not do justice to the idea of constitutional democracy, where the key word is balance. And balance cannot exist without a counterbalance. Without a counterbalance, any form of power, even the power of a democratically elected majority, even the power of a democratically elected majority, risks becoming absolutism. A constitutional democracy is balanced between the state and society. There can be no political democracy without societal democracy in the form of a strong civil society. And constitutional democracy is also characterized by a balance within the state, the separation of powers between the three branches of government, namely the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Unelected institutions, including the judiciary and the monarch, have an important part to play in preserving the balance between the state and society and between the three branches of government. So the crown is not democratic in itself, but it could help to maintain democracy. Together, the institutions of the state serve as guardians against the abuse of power. But what role can the king play in a climate where a counterbalance can readily be viewed as opposition by politicians and office holders? In the balance within the state, the king is a custodian of the constitutional rules. He must verify that institutions can and do perform their proper function, that fundamental and social rights are respected, and that general principles and values, including equality, proportionality, and the principles of good governance, are observed. On ascending the throne, the king took an oath on the Constitution, and for good reasons. The fact that the king cannot be held politically responsible for acts of government does not mean that he bears no responsibility at all. if that were the case, an oath on the Constitution would be meaningless. The role of custodian of the constitutional rules becomes more important in times of uncertainty when the executive wants to project, resolve and take action. And such times constitutional rules are relegated to a subordinate rank. Indeed, they are often forgotten completely, also by politicians. So a number of questions arise. How can the king fulfill the role of custodian of the constitutional rules, or in your terms, being moderator and arbitrator, solely with the help of the three rights to which he is entitled? The right to be consulted, the right to encourage, the right to warn about it. What priorities should he set? Given the potential impact of royal intervention, the king should be selective. Who will support him in this custodianship, given the absence of a constitutional court in the Netherlands, for example? What constitutional rules are we talking about? And when should the king actually enter the fray? Then the balance between state and society. In the balance between state and society, the king can contribute to societal democracy or the civil society in several ways. Through his commitment to issues that affect society, by publicly focusing on new developments and longer term, by transcending special interests, by acknowledging individual initiatives, and paying attention to people. Royal attention gives individuals a sense of recognition, raises public awareness of matters that might otherwise be overlooked, and can forge links, for example, between institutions. The need for individual recognition, public awareness, and institutional links grows as divisions between groups of citizens become more clearly marked, vested interests claim the most attention, and public and private responsibility tends to overlap. However, all this makes the king's role more complicated. He must be aware of events and trends in society at large. Who provides this information? A research institute or think tank, for example? He must understand other realities, for multiple realities always exist at any one time. The reality of people's lives and the reality that government officials see. The reality of economists and social-cultural reality. How is he to acquire this understanding? For example, by making working visits? He must have the authority to be able to use his knowledge and experience effectively and to develop a strategy to this end. Who helps him to implement his strategy? The King's Office, for example? He must issue warnings in good time if drastic changes are looming. When is the right time to do so? And then some remarks on monarchy and politics. When people in the Netherlands talk about politics, they usually mean political institutions, political office holders. Far less attention is paid to the function of politics. This is something of a handicap when monarchy and politics is a topic for discussion, as it is on this summer course. The function of politics means determining at all times what is best for public interest. As David Easton put it, the authoritative allocation of values and scarce resources. An authoritative allocation of this kind calls for a vision of the kind of society we want to live in and what government can or should contribute to such society. This function is less and less embraced by political office holders and institutions, explicitly or otherwise. Over recent decades, political visions have faded, while politicians has increasingly focused on the here and now. Political institutions and office holders have lost authority. Politics is now all about arranging things and coping with crises as they arise. This means that perspective is lost and political allocation of values become implicit. When political institutions and political office holders neglect the function of politics, the position of the king is affected. His political role, the authoritative allocation of values, grows more important, for the king symbolizes the values that, throughout history, by trial and error, have become shared constitutional values. His authority often prevails over politics. However, this also renders him more vulnerable. Anything can become a subject of party political controversy at any time, helped by the competition between political parties and the fight for public, or should I say, media attention. Any debate about the monarch always generates publicity and can pose a dilemma for the king. On the one hand, he should keep his distance from politics and not get involved in political controversies. Otherwise, his authority will be undermined. On the other hand, his authority is a form of moral authority based on his role as the symbol of shared values and the country's national identity. He should promote those values and embody that identity. Otherwise, he will undermine his own authority. But politics is neglecting those shared constitutional values, and uncertainty about national identity is growing. In politics, images and sentiments easily gain the upper hand over facts and values. And this gives rise to more questions. How does a king cope with this friction? How does he know how much scope is available to him, and how does he make use of it? Who helps him to do so? Does he know what is going on in politics beneath the depoliticized surface? And is he aware of party political sensitivities? What opportunities does he have for direct contact with politicians in a fragmented political landscape, marked by a shrinking center of growing polarization? How can he forestall irritation among public and politicians alike, often about the expense of the monarchy? Or provide answers to such questions that are based on facts and substance? What is the role of social media? These are just a few observations and questions prompted by the overall theme of this summer course, Monarchy and Politics in Democratic Systems. There is, of course, much more to be said on this topic, as well as on the authority of the monarch and the monarch in Europe. And I have written short papers on both these subjects, and you find these over there. This brings me to the topic assigned to me, the crown in the government formation process in the Netherlands, which is an example of the evolution of the relationship between the king and political democracy. I discussed this subject at greater length earlier this year in Madrid. The text had been published on the website of the Elcano Institute, so today I'll confine my remarks to the main points, focusing on the role of the king, the task of the informateur, a term I will explain later, the phases of the process, the increased influence of the House of Representatives, and the consequent party politicization of the process of forming a government. The process I'm about to describe can be understood only on the basis of Dutch constitutional developments and cannot be copied exactly. Spain and the Netherlands differ in terms of their society and politics, historical background, and parliamentary tradition, regional development and cultural variety. To understand the process of forming government in the Netherlands, one must realize that the Netherlands is traditionally a country of minorities. The Dutch electoral system, proportional representation with no constituencies or threshold for representation in parliament, makes it relatively easy for a party to be elected independently to the House of Representatives. Coalitions of at least two, but often more, in the years to come, perhaps 5 parties, are inevitable. If parties don't rule out the possibility of working together in advance, the election results will always provide a basis for several different coalitions. Nothing compulsory or enforceable is laid down about the process of forming a government. The Constitution states only that ministers and state secretaries are appointed and dismissed by royal decree. This defines the king's role. Otherwise, the formation of a government is not regulated by legislation of any kind. However, the process is governed by unwritten constitutional rules. The most important rule is that a government may not remain in office if it has lost the confidence of a majority of the House. So the composition of a new government must ensure that it's not voted out by a majority on its first appearance before Parliament. The formation process aims to guarantee that the new government can muster a parliamentary majority, and this explains the role of the House of Representatives. Since no one party ever gains a majority, the important thing is which party emerges as the largest. Until the 50s, the king always asked the leader of the biggest party to be the first formateur. That is, to form a new coalition government. But during the subsequent negotiations, the other parties often obstructed these formateurs to such an extent that they failed in their task. In 1951, this practice was curbed by the introduction of the informateur, appointed by the king. An informateur is a go-between with a certain amount of influence, even outside his own political party, and often somewhat removed from active politics. The king would ask this informateur to explore the options and inform him which parties could usually negotiate on the possibility of working together, and what primary issues of differences should be the subject of such negotiations. The informateur's report, which was originally revealed only to the king, but in later years was published as well, made clear to everyone how the various options had been explored and why certain potential coalitions had promised or should be dropped, at least for the time being. Highlighting substantive differences helped clarify why some parties were not willing to work with each other. An informateur's report could also make clear that a particular political party had to be involved in every possible coalition in order to achieve a majority. Until recently, the king's role as initiator and guide was particularly important at the beginning of the process of forming government. The day after the election, the king would begin by consulting his permanent advisors, the presidents of the Senate and the House of Representatives, and the vice president of the Council of State. Their advice was given in their official capacity and not on behalf of the institution in question. They gave their interpretation of how the election result would affect the forming of a new coalition. The advisors' opinions were not published but were made available to successive informateurs and formateurs. Next, the king received the leaders of all the parties newly elected to the House of Representatives in order of the number of seats they had won. Each was asked the following questions. What's your interpretation of the election result? What are the options for a coalition? Which of these should be explored first? Who should act as informateur and with what instructions? By asking each party leader the same question in turn, the king could determine if potential informateurs were acceptable to other party leaders and if agreement were possible on the instructions. All this helped to foster consensus and reduce the risk that the king would be accused of making political choices. If the views of the party leaders pointed in the same direction, the king had less room for maneuver. But if the party leaders disagreed, the king would try to find as much common ground as possible and use this as the basis for the choice of an informateur and his instructions. Publishing the opinions of the parliamentary party leaders made it possible to check that the king had made a reasonable decision. These early stages in the process have been described as the objectivity ritual. Every party, however large or small, was consulted and its views taken into account when drafting the instructions for the first informateur. Precise wording of the informateur's instructions made it possible to divide the formation process in manageable phases. An informateur could go no further than his instructions allowed. Once he had carried them out, he would submit his final report to the king with an advisory opinion. On the basis of this opinion, the king would draw up new instructions and once again appoint an informateur, who might be the same person, or a formateur. Forming a government was then and still is a matter of proceeding in phases. I stress that. Forming a government is a matter of proceeding in phases. Don't try to reach immediately the final result. An informateur has several different tasks. I shall examine 4 of them. First, informateurs must protect the king from political fallout. They are able to do so because they have more room to maneuver than the king. They have more freedom to analyze the political situation and consider which coalition options should be dropped, at least for the time being, and which should be explored first. Second, they can cool things down after a heated election campaign. It sometimes takes time for politicians, and indeed their parties, to switch from forcefully arguing about political differences before the election to seeking areas of agreement and compromise after it. So, take time. Time helps in cooling down. Third, an informateur has to bring the negotiating parties to a joint conclusion that they would not be willing or able or bold enough to reach on their own. This imposes demands on informateurs, their methods, step by step, and their reporting. Afterwards, all the negotiating parties have to be able to convince their supporters that this joint conclusion is both logical and justified. And fourth task, informateurs can save a future formateur from failure by doing work that is actually part of the formateur's remit. All newly appointed formateurs or informateurs begin by explaining why they accepted the assignment and instructions. It's the informateur and not the king who publicly accepts responsibility. It is not done for an informateur to say, I accepted this assignment because the king asked me to. This public acceptance of responsibility takes place at the informateur's first press conference, where he also explains how he will proceed. Informateurs are also personally responsible for the reports they submit to the king. They render account for the advice given in the final report and explain this at the press conference. And if invited, they explain their work and its outcome in a debate in the House of Representatives. At regular points throughout the process, announcements are made or press briefings given about the informateur's progress. Agreements on media relations are made during the informateur's first meeting with the party leaders involved. He may, if he wishes, use a spokesperson and several, but usually 2 expert advisors, always career civil servants from the Minister of General Affairs, who are seconded to the informateur or formateur for the duration of the formation process. The informateur may also approach other experts or request information from the various government ministries. He will mainly make use of this opportunity in the second phase of the formation process during the negotiations on the coalition agreement. Roughly speaking, the process of forming a government in the Netherlands comprises 3 phases. First, the exploratory phase to determine which parliamentary parties come to the negotiating table. Up to now, this has always taken 1 to 3 weeks. Second, the constructive phase, during which the negotiating parties examine whether they actually want to join forces to form a government and whether they can agree on a joint policy program that will become a coalition agreement. This is generally the longest phase and can last from 1 to 4 months. Third, the actual formation phase, in which individuals are invited to take office in the proposed government. And this phase often progresses remarkably swiftly. A week is by no means exceptional. The most time is thus devoted to drawing up a coalition agreement that a majority of newly elected House supports, or at least does not openly oppose. The need for a more detailed coalition agreement increases as parties lose some of their permanent support base and hence become more nervous about opinion polls, and the political center ground shrinks so that more parties are needed for a majority. That's what has happened in recent decades. However, detailed agreements have considerable disadvantages. First, a detailed coalition agreement limits the scope and legitimizing function of parliamentary debate and undermines Parliament's primary role. Second, coalition agreements increasingly contain policy intentions that would not gain majority support if they were not included in the agreement, while excluding some other measures that could count on a variable majority in the new parliament. This too undermines the legitimacy of certain measures. And third disadvantage is the constant changes caused by external influences. Arrangements included in a coalition agreement thus quickly become out of date and sometimes counterproductive. And lastly, a detailed coalition agreement forces parliamentary parties into a form of unity that not only restricts the independence which individual members of parliament are supposed to enjoy, but also prevents parties from readjusting their political position. However, a substantive reorientation may be acquired if the answers to fundamental questions facing a government no longer follow traditional party lines. And this is now the case more and more often. And I believe that a coalition agreement should do no more than outline policies, establish a financial framework, and contain specific agreements only on matters that could conceivably lead to a political crisis in the first 6 months of the government's term. To date, this has not happened. Every party in a coalition wants to secure as much as possible for itself in the coalition agreement. Since 1946, at least, the Dutch Parliament has been gradually tightening its grip on the process of forming government. At the same time, it has drastically reduced the scope for the king to follow its own preference when appointing formateurs and informateurs. Several points clearly illustrate this trend. First, it has become customary for the king to consult all the party leaders in the newly elected House of Representatives on their interpretation of the election results and what should happen on the basis of those results. Next, the opinions submitted to the king by the party leaders are now made public. Third, each report submitted by the king to the king by the successive informateurs and formatives is now sent to Parliament, published and discussed at a press conference. If requested, informateurs and formateurs then brief the House of Representatives on their work. By 2012, the parliamentary takeover seemed complete with an amendment to the rules of procedure of the House of Representatives. This amendment reads, immediately after taking their seats, the members of the newly elected House of Representatives meet in plenary session to deliberate on the election results, with the aim of appointing one or more informateurs or formateurs and drawing up their instructions. With this amendment, the House of Representatives took the initiative into its own hands. Informateurs and formateurs are no longer to be appointed by the king, but by the House of Representatives. However, this change also represents the demise of the objectivity ritual I mentioned earlier. Let me explain. Until 2012, the king, the head of state above party politics, received all the party leaders in turn immediately after the election. In these conversations, the king discovered who had sufficient standing and support within and beyond their own political circle to be entrusted with the first exploratory phase. In 2012, however, the leader of the largest party met with the other party leaders and proposed in that meeting that an active politician, a member of his own party, be instructed to conduct the initial phase. This politicized the beginning of the formation process, possibly to the disadvantage of the smaller parties. In the past, different potential coalitions were considered or provisionally ruled out for given reasons in the initial phase. In 2012, however, a preliminary sorting process yielded a single coalition opinion from the very start. Personally, I deeply regret this disappearance of the objectivity ritual. The significance of this ritual, when the king received all the party leaders at the palace, has been gravely underestimated. For a short while after the election campaign, it is visible lifted the initial phase of the process above party politics. It created a level playing field where the same rules applied to all parties. This had a calming effect. Each party felt it was being taken seriously. Forming a government is also a matter of political psychology. Mistakes made at the beginning of the process are difficult to remedy and can have long-lasting effects, even lasting to the next formation. This is something the House of Representatives did not fully take into account in its decision. It would have been better if, in the first phase of the formation process, the House had left the initiative in the King's hands. At the same time, the House should have decided to meet in plenary session after each phase of the process to deliberate on the results of the work done by the informateur or formateur in that phase. These deliberations could then have concluded with a vote on the informateur or formateur to be appointed by the king and the instructions given to him. This would have maintained the objectivity ritual and, at the same time, limited the influence of the king even further. In short, it was a lost opportunity. Thank you very much.
you very much, Herman, for providing us with two things. First of all, a very interesting introduction in which you've really given us a roadmap, I think, for future research and future debates, basically on the general question of the relationship between the monarchy and democracy, which is, of course, why we're here. And secondly, for providing us with this detailed and very and fascinating account of how the Dutch process has worked. I always remember that the political scientist Liphart used to describe the Dutch system as the epitome of consociationalism, and that the role of coalitions, therefore, has always been an integral part of the Dutch political system. And you quite rightly pointed out that Spain is a very different kind of political animal, but at the same time, we often forget that although we have a majoritarian system, our system is in fact the most majoritarian proportional representation system in the world. So much so that it has in the past produced results which were much closer to the first past the post systems than the traditional PR systems like the Dutch or the extreme case Israel. Well, I won't go into questions now. I have a lot of questions for the session, perhaps this afternoon as well, and it would be interesting if you could provide some personal detail and some personal colour on your role in that process. That was fascinating. Thank you very much. Robert, the floor is yours.
Right, many thanks, Charles. What I'm going to try and do today then is give a characterisation of the UK monarchy, giving it from the perspective of a constitutional lawyer, but providing some politics and historical context as well. And in that context, I think of the public function and role of the monarchy, look at the role of the Queen in government formation. And I think really the first thing I should say is I'm markedly struck by the politicisation of the monarchies that have been described so far in this conference, and particularly in Spain, obviously, but also in the Netherlands. And I think the prevailing view in the UK is that monarchy is essentially a creature of the past. It requires careful nurturing if it's going to last long in the future. And the most important way of nurturing its survival in the future is to keep it out of politics. Yeah. It needs to be impartial and detached from the political process so far as possible. So I am struck by this great contrast that a lot of the discussion that's taken place so far has been how to frame the activist monarch. And of course, the role of the monarch in Spain is actually put into the constitution, so it's quite difficult if you actually have got an activist role for the monarch actually in your constitutional law. So it seems to me that there are great dangers in the way in which your politics and constitutional law are framed, I have to say, but to some this may be heresy. And speaking of heresy, and as I said to Charles, I think the day before yesterday, I'm usually more comfortable discussing these matters under what we call in the UK Chatham House rules. But I understand that this is being recorded, so I must be particularly careful what I say. And for example, until the 1990s, one would not be discussing abolition of the monarchy in respectable circles. I would not have discussed it in my seminars at universities. It would have just been regarded as not on. It was a taboo subject socially. And that says something, I think, about the attitudes towards the monarchy and its status, perhaps. Things have liberalised or freed up since the 1990s, and politicians similarly wouldn't describe themselves or come out publicly as a Republican in Britain if they wanted to hold ministerial office or hold important positions, really down to the 1990s. And the first high-profile politician who did do that was Tony Benn. He was a left-winger. He had probably given up or hope on being a cabinet minister again, but he published a draft written constitution, which he called the Commonwealth of Britain, which had a president instead of a monarch. So it's only relatively recently that we have even sort of discussed the possibility that the monarchy might ever not exist in the future. And the monarchy remains remarkably popular in the United Kingdom. Public opinion polls, which I've had done recently, but which are done for the media anyway, show that overwhelmingly over 3/4 of the public favour the continuation of the monarchy. So it's not an issue, a defining issue in terms of identity and partisanship, anything like the extent to which it is in Spain, where it's really ingrained in political divisions and attitudes towards politics generally. But having said that, I've as part of my research, and I've been conducting a programme and series of studies on the monarchy in recent years. But public opinion polling also shows that if you dig below the surface and ask more sophisticated questions of the public, you'll find out that actually the level of support for the monarchy is quite fragile and shallow. I mean that in the sense that it's not important to people's lives in the way that it was previously. And I'll come on in a while to say something about the public positions and role of the monarchy, but there is a strong spiritual dimension of monarchy as well. Another opinion poll in the infancy of opinion polling in the UK back in the 1950s, an interesting opinion poll was taken at the time when the Queen ascended the throne in 1952, when as many as, I think, 35% of the population believed that the Queen had personally been chosen by God to be monarch. Now, for some that still might be true, but it does show a very strong connection, I think, between religion and the authority and status of the monarchy. Now, and at the same time, and I won't say much more about history after this, at the same time, the nature of British society has been transformed over the 64-year of reign of the Queen. Still, in the post-war years of the early 1950s, Britain was still a class-orientated society. When I was a lad, growing up in the 50s and 60s, you could tell what class people were just by looking at them. The professional middle-class man wore a bowler hat, the working man wore a flat cap. The type of cigarettes he smoked, you could tell number 6 were for working-class men and Benson and Hedges were for middle-class respectable people. If somebody had a copy of the Times under their armpit, that meant they were upper middle class, or they'd be reading the Mirror or the Sketch if they were working class. And the manners, the way they spoke, everything. Now that, so I think probably of all the European states, we've had that class system with us for quite a long time. Now it's more or less evaporated. I still think that you can only understand a lot of the way in which British society operates today in the context of the legacy of that class system, some sort of backlash to some extent on it, and we have all societies have some sort of class structure, of course, but ours is of a different nature today, and it's very different to what it was in the 1950s. So all this needs emphasising because the precedents we have of Queen Elizabeth relate to Queen Elizabeth as an individual, and I'll be coming on perhaps later on to say something about the nature of heredity or hereditariness, which I think is fundamental to what people's attitudes towards the role of a monarch should be. But traumatic experiences do linger in the collective memory, of course, and 1936, the 80th anniversary of that, because this year was a traumatic year for the British monarchy and in British public life when we had an abdication. There was a king who'd come to the throne, enormously popular. If you like, a male version of Princess Diana. He was the most famous celebrity in the world by a long way. He globe-trotted, There were photographs of him in all the glossy magazines, and he'd been Prince of Wales, this golden boy, for 25 years, a very long preparation for kingship. Seemed ideal, but he clearly wasn't cut out for the job. He didn't really want the job. He found all the trappings of ceremony and having to dress up idiotic. He was American. He was very fond of, had a lot of friends who were American, so he was that classlessness of the Americans. And one way or the other, the establishment got rid of him. One way or the other, which is another story. But that was an enormous shock because the establishment and the royal family were terrified that the monarchy might actually collapse. And the establishment very much wants to nurture and maintain the monarchy as well. And I think that's an important impulse to remember. If the monarchy collapses, we will have to have a written constitution, and the executive ministers derive enormous power, legally and politically, by virtue of the common law theory of the royal prerogative, which I'll say a little bit more about later. So those are introductory. I'd better be careful because we've got limited time. But a lot of these questions I can come back to in the discussions and questions and answers in the afternoon. The main point I should make, perhaps, however, that in the UK, the role of the monarch is essentially ceremonial. That's what it has become, and I think that's, although the legal theory is something different, and I'll say something about that, that is what I think everybody at the moment thinks it should remain. The Queen has performed this function in the changing nature of society over the last 64 years absolutely masterfully. She has been perfect for the role. She has, of course, she has her own private opinions and views, but she has kept them privately to herself. She has a quiet dignity about her. She's able to do the, if you like, the dressing up, the crowns, the fairy tale nature of monarchy that people love so much. She's able to do that without pomposity, and that is, quite an art. So we've been extremely fortunate with this individual on the throne. Now, the context within which the monarchy operates, then, as I've said, really the crown is the basis of our constitution. We don't have a written constitution. This, incidentally, I would have to say, explains some of our present malaise for those who follows British politics. We don't have any authoritative statement telling us where democratic authority lies in the state. The word sovereignty is bandied about in a most ambiguous and unclear way, with politicians using it to promote whatever cause they themselves are championing. Parliamentary sovereignty 1 minute, popular sovereignty the next, royal sovereignty another minute, global sovereignty some other times. So it's a rather meaningless concept, really, but how can it be that the House of Commons, by a clear majority, thinks that we should remain in the European Union, but yet one party, the Conservative government in power, asked for a referendum when really nobody else wanted it. So we have a situation where the House of Commons thinks we should remain in the European Union, but a plebiscite has been called on it, and the government is now determined that we will be leaving the EU. There are other complexities too in this, but the Crown is the basis of the Constitution, and one aspect of that is that all the residual or basic functions of government aren't derived from any written constitution, spelling out what those powers are, defending the realm, war and peace, appointment of ministers, departments of state, etc. Those aren't derived from any written constitution, they're derived from the common law. The common law simply means a power that has existed since time immemorial and which everyone accepts exists. Perhaps is so obvious and basic that it hasn't even been spelt out in a court of law, but if it had to be, then it would be. So the royal prerogative, these inherent crown powers, are actually exercised by ministers and the Prime Minister in the Queen's name. All government operates in the Queen's name, Her Majesty's government, Her Majesty's loyal opposition, the royal courts of justice, etc., etc. Now, this also means that in terms of regulation, and as a constitutional lawyer, we're particularly concerned with regulation, is that we speak in terms of conventions, rules. So a convention for us is then a maxim, a habit, a tradition, but a rule, a constitutional rule, which is really sometimes as important as a law or even more important than a law, but it won't be recognised and enforced through courts of law. Now, some very basic conventions, I suppose, is that ministers must have a seat in Parliament to be appointed. Perhaps the most basic one of all is at the sheer existence of a Prime Minister is a pure convention. There's no law in the United Kingdom that we should have a Prime Minister, and therefore certainly there isn't any law relating to the appointment, tenure, or anything else about a Prime Minister. Conventions also tell you, sometimes make sense of archaic law, and a lot of our law is very archaic. So in strict law, the Queen has got an absolute power to say yes or no to legislation, but constitutional convention is exactly the opposite, that the Queen will virtually automatically give assent to legislation, that there hasn't been a royal veto for over 300 years. Basically, it's a rubber stamping that due process has been satisfied. Now, the problem with this regulation, the conventions being so important, is that in academic law and in our textbooks and for persons studying law degrees, we spend a huge amount of time studying the nature of conventions, how you can establish whether they exist or not, or whatever. And in my view, these conventions, we should have a written constitution. I think the time for a constitution has certainly come. And again, I think the episode of the referendum just shows that we need a process for constitutional reform, for heaven's sake. At the very least, the legislature should actually approve the measure. I mean, it will do through legislation, of course. But that means that the conventions are quite often poorly understood even by our politicians, certainly poorly understood by the media and by the public at large. Again, I think it seems to me that the huge and obvious advantage to a constitution is that you can go out and buy a copy of it, and certainly now that we are a less deferential and classless orientated society, ordinary people should know the rules by which we're actually governed as well. I think I will move on swiftly to look at government formation, but just briefly, you need to bear in mind about the Queen. Is not only Queen of the United Kingdom, but of 15 other realms. She's head of the Commonwealth, she's head of the Armed Forces, but this is purely ceremonial. She's head of the Church of England. We have an established church. She has multiple formal titles and roles, but virtually all of them are purely formal and ceremonial. Now, the characterization of the process of government formation is more straightforward, I think, than in your countries, I think. And we have had in the past a strong two-party system. In fact, if you bought a politics textbook only a few decades ago, it would probably say characteristics of the British Constitution, two-party system. And a lot of our constitutional process is founded upon this two-party system. If you look at the House of Commons, you have these two sides facing one another. We have a highly adversarial process of politics, which we think is very healthy. It brings ministers down to earth with a bump. It reminds ministers that they're just ordinary jumped-up MPs. There's a very close and direct personal accountability of ministers and prime ministers to the legislature, and that is the strength of our system as well. So that two-party system is fed, I think, by two things which are actually weakening. So I think there are dangers for us on the horizon and lessons to learn from other European countries and monarchies as well. The two-party system has been strengthened firstly by the class system. There are, I suppose, two defining issues in how people voted in the 20th century. Firstly, according to class. So the two main parties were the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, since 1918 anyway, when Labour eclipsed the Liberal Party. And the working man, Labour stood for the working movement and the working man, so the working man supported Labour, and respectable people, middle classes, voted Conservative. And you might have some intellectuals voting for Labour as well. I think Labour has always been had three components within it. It's been represented Labour, the trade unions, the working class movement. It's represented the intellectuals, if you like, that have provided socialist ideology, and professional politicians, the front men, if you like, who actually held ministerial office. But that has been evaporating as the nature of British society has evaporated as well, and voting is now much more volatile than at any time in the past. The other characterization that has promoted a two-party system is, of course, our particular method of voting. First past the post, the simple plurality system. And like most of our constitutional life, is a historical accident. You can really only understand the origins of what we have through history. Things happen, political events happen, and we theorize or justify or make sense of them after the event. That's the British way. We don't go in for any big ideas. First past the post, as I say, was an accident. It's founded in the 1918 Representation of the People Act, when we created the universal suffrage. But basically, the House of Commons favoured the alternative vote. The House of Lords favoured proportional representation. They couldn't agree with one another, so by default we kept what we'd had before, which was first past the post voting, which made sense in the 19th century because we had multi-member constituencies. But over the course of the 20th century, by the 1940s, they were whittled down from 3 or 2 member constituencies to 1, so we ended up with first past the post voting. This promotes the greatest deviation from proportionality you can have. So you have very wide deviation from proportionality. But when you have a two-party system, to some extent it cancels one another out, because you might have somebody wins in a constituency by getting 48% of the votes, and the other person, the runner-up, got 47% of the votes. All the votes for the 47% are wasted, as it were, don't have any representation, but it can happen the other way around, so it cancels out. So that's the background, I think, and so it has tended to produce majorities in the House of Commons, and the party leader of that majority party has been obviously Prime Minister, and there's been less of any problem or issue to be resolved by the monarch. Running through the precedents, then after all general elections really over the past 100 years, where there has been an outright majority for one party, that party leader has been appointed by the King or Queen Prime Minister. A few variations I'll comment on going through the last 100 years. So in 1915, so I'll look at some cases where there was a change of administration during the lifetime of a parliament without a general election having taken place. I like to think that a very healthy aspect of British life is that in times of national emergency, the response of the political system has not been to lurch towards a single-party dictatorship, but to embrace a coalition. And that's happened in both the two world wars and in times of dire financial crisis in 1931. So in the First World War, the Liberal government collapsed and a coalition was formed under Lloyd George, who was an acceptable politician across the three main parties in a wartime coalition. The same thing happened in 1940, where the Conservatives were in power, but there was a censure motion in Neville Chamberlain, who had lost the confidence of the House, largely initially from his policy of appeasement of Germany, and then of a disaster when Norway was occupied and we failed to defend it, and Churchill took over, who commanded the confidence of the other parties. In 1931 was an interesting episode, and I would say that this was the last occasion on which the monarch intervened and had an active role in government formation. And what happened that year was that there was a minority Labour administration, the second minority Labour administration in the 20th century. And there was the Wall Street crash, financial disaster. We were in massive debt to the American bankers, J.P. Morgan's, and J.P. Morgan's threatened to call in the debt unless certain conditions that it laid down weren't satisfied by the British cabinet. And those were that there had to be public expenditure cuts being made. The Labour cabinet was unwilling to administer those public expenditure cuts, and so they resigned office. The King then, George V, came down from Scotland and entered into negotiations with the Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, and with Stanley Baldwin, coming back from holiday. Stanley Baldwin, whenever there was a crisis, seemed to always be on holiday. And the King basically brokered a national government. All this was done in secret, and it suited Stanley Baldwin for Ramsay MacDonald to remain in office as Prime Minister over a national government, because he would be presiding over public expenditure cuts, which would be more palatable if coming from somebody who was seen as being on the left. And Stanley Baldwin wouldn't like to do it because he might incur the wrath of the electorate if he was doing it as well. When this was found out by the Labour Party, they were outraged, and Ramsay MacDonald was expelled from the Labour Party along with the other defectors, including Philip Snowden. But the King had brokered this national government in 1931, and they went to the polls. It was originally intended as a very short temporary expedient, but in fact they went to the polls later on in the year in 1931 as a national government, with Ramsay MacDonald standing as independent Labour because he'd been expelled from the Labour Party, and they cleaned up at the electorate as well. So this front of Ramsay MacDonald, a former Labour Prime Minister, and the Conservatives and the Liberals cleaned up. Now that episode went down in Labour folklore as a terrible episode. It was a palace coup, etc. It was written about in very derogatory terms. And I think the situation hasn't arisen again, but I think it also showed that it is a lesson that in 1931, because of the status of the Crown and because things were done in an underhand way as well, it may have been for the best or whatever. But the danger of, I think, a king getting involved and using their prerogative as a moderator or mediator in these situations is that they are likely to upset one party. And that party will come back into power one day, and there might be repercussions upon the monarchy. I've alluded to 1936, but it does show that, that if there is a monarch on the throne who's unpopular with a government, they will be got rid of. So the lessons of history, I suppose, from the 1930s are that it's a good idea for monarchs to keep out of politics, and they can and will be removed ruthlessly if necessary. Otherwise, when have there been hung parliaments? There was a hung parliament in 1923, That was a strange equation. It was the greatest hung parliament we probably had over the last 100 years, or was. The Conservatives got 258 seats, the Labour got 191, and the Liberals under Asquith got 158. So Baldwin was the incumbent Prime Minister. He remained in office, but when the House of Commons met, and at the beginning of each new Parliament, there's a Queen's speech and an address to the Crown. That's an opportunity for the opposition to table a motion of no confidence. So at that point, Labour and the Liberal Democrats combined for a censure motion in the government, and Baldwin resigned office. Asquith didn't want to take office, so Labour take office as the first minority administration. So it was settled through a vote in the House of Commons. In 1974, there were two elections. In the first February election, what had happened there was that the Conservative Prime Minister under Edward Heath had got into industrial problems. The country was in a terrible state. The miners were on strike. There were electricity shortages. It was a 3-day working week. So Edward Heath called an election on who governs Britain. And the electorate decided, well, if you don't know, we don't think it should be you. That's unfair on Edward Heath. That's perhaps, of course, what he was asking was for the backing of the country in his battle with the miners. But anyway, there was the result was a very fragile majority, a hung parliament, and Edward Heath remained in office for a short period of time to see if he could cobble together a coalition with the Liberals. When that failed, he then resigned office, and the leader of the opposition, Harold Wilson, became Prime Minister, and then after a respectable period, and after doing a few popular things, called another general election and were returned to office with a small majority. And then, of course, there was very recently another hung parliament, and because there hadn't been a hung parliament before 2010 for quite a long period of time, for 30 years, since 1974, people had really forgotten what had happened and what might happen, and so there were fears of a constitutional crisis. But things happened exactly as the conventions indicated quite clearly, and that the convention is that the incumbent remains in office, but if they can't form an administration, then they resign, and the leader of the opposition will be appointed Prime Minister, and that's exactly what happened. Gordon Brown, the incumbent Prime Minister in 2010, remained in office while inter-party talks took place. Gordon Brown's attempts to cobble a coalition together failed, but David Cameron succeeded in doing it with the Liberal Party. And throughout that period, the Queen was kept informed, but did not play any active role in the negotiations whatsoever. There is a curious document that was produced by the Cabinet Office around that time. The Cabinet Office was concerned at the prospects of a hung parliament in the 12 months before the 2010 election, because the opinion polls suggested that it could happen, although hung parliaments are actually an arithmetic fluke under first past the post voting, and had produced a manual sort of codifying, if you like, the procedures on what would happen. And it did emphasise there, because the palace was actually consulted, that the Queen would not expect to be involved in the negotiation. So there was no expectation or need or requirement, and a very good thing too. So I think I'm probably out of time, really, apart from saying
this may deserve a mention.
One more too. Yes. Probably the three areas where royal intervention might occur in recent times or where there is a legal power which has been debated, certainly in academia. First of all is perhaps, I think, in terms of royal assent. Are there any circumstances in which it might be legitimate for a monarch to refuse assent? But personally, I would say there are none. But you are reliant upon what convention, and there are those academics who have drawn up lists of situations, an act of parliament that sought to subvert the democratic basis of the constitution, etc., or want to sort of abolish freedom of speech or something like that, etc. But they're rather far-fetched situations. One is mindful of the Belgian experience when King Baudouin was presented with a bill that he found morally repugnant. It was an abortion law reform. And they found ways around that by him basically abdicating for a day and a half, the council of council taking over the royal powers, giving the assent, and then he came back again. And maybe some regency could be created if the future King Charles III, Prince Charles, if he found that he had some crisis of moral conscience around some bill or whatever, which you can't imagine. The Queen, has been perfect at subordinating her private views or private beliefs to her public duties, but a more opinionated monarch might have some difficulties. So I think that's not really an issue. But a more grave issue, I think, has been or a more serious issue, has been over dissolution affairs. Because previously, the Parliament, because we don't have a written constitution stipulating there shall be a Parliament and what its terms are, how long it'll be, Parliament is treated just like the personal creature of the Crown. It comes into existence when the Queen says there shall be a Parliament, and it's dissolved when the Crown says it is dissolved, and it's dealt with by royal proclamations. Acts of Parliament have regulated it, though Acts of Parliament do prevail over the royal prerogative. The earlier Acts of Parliament, the Septennial Act, laid down that a Parliament can't last longer than 7 years. Then that was reduced to 5 years under the Parliament Act 1911. But within that 5-year time frame, there would be a dissolution. And the King or Queen would dissolve Parliament upon the advice of the Prime Minister. So Prime Ministers could call an election whenever they liked, and of course they called it at the time they thought they were most likely to win the election, or conversely avoid times when they were least likely to win the election. So if they were unpopular, they'd serve the whole full 5-term. At any time after 3 years, when they were doing well in the opinion polls, they would call a snap election at that point, giving minimal notice to the electorate. So there'd been a low-level support for fixed-term parliaments for some time, and I supported that myself. I wrote my PhD thesis on it. But to everyone's surprise, the Conservative government actually introduced it shortly after taking office in 2010, because it was part of the coalition deal with the Liberal Democrats. Actually, it was triggered to try and cement the coalition so that it would have a 5-year lifetime. So there are those who would like to, in fact, repeal the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, and it's not entirely solid. But the Fixed Term Parliament Act 2011 is a very significant piece of legislation, and it has abolished the prerogative of dissolution. Now, in my other writings, I won't go into this now, but in my other writings, I've said that we do need to bear in mind the conventions that existed before the Fixed Term Parliament Acts, because, as I say, there is quite a strong lobby to repeal it, who think that it's actually hampered the executive not being able to call an election over certain matters, that the old conventions, that the old prerogative of dissolution will probably revive on repeal of the Act, and the conventions need to be borne in mind as well. But there is one, I think, significant procedure in the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which is that you can have an early general election in two situations. Firstly, if 2/3 of the membership vote that there shall be an early general election. And secondly, if there's, on a simple majority, a motion of no confidence in the government, and within 14 days there's no motion of confidence in a new government. So we now have a statutory procedure for confidence motions in the government. Now, that's always been a possibility, and Prime Ministers have asked for the confidence of the House from time to time, but I think that statutory, the fact it's in statute is quite significant. And there are those, and I would approve of it myself, who think, to repeat as I've said earlier, that I think inter-party negotiations as to who is going to be Prime Minister is a matter for the party leaders. It's worked satisfactorily in the past. We don't need any moderating role from an hereditary monarch. I think there are great dangers in involving the monarchy in government formation. If there had to be a public official in doing this at all, I think it should be the Speaker of the House of Commons, as in their Swedish model, etc. And I think there should be a formal motion of confidence in the new Prime Minister as well, as analogous perhaps to this statutory new procedure. Now, in a sense, there always is, because you have a motion to approve the address, the loyal address to the Queen at the opening of a new Parliament. But I think perhaps the more archaic rituals should be replaced by ones which are very clear as to what it is they are actually doing. I think for the future, just in the last minute or two, the British Constitution is on the move. I think since 1997, with a large battery of constitutional reforms which have taken place, the Human Rights Act, London Mayor, Scottish Parliament, freedom of information, a vast number of constitutional changes have taken place, and now, if we really are, which I still find difficult to believe, going to be leaving the European Union, I think all these things are indicative of greater codification of our constitutional law. It might take place in one or two stages, but I think even the Union itself, the state of the Union between England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, needs some stability to it. So there might be a statute on the Union, but I think, and I've been working on this as special counsel to a House of Commons committee over the last 5 years, I think we are moving towards a written constitution in the not too distant future. And I think that constitution would continue the process of codifying the royal prerogative powers as well. We have, over the last 10 years, been codifying some of these old crown powers, that the existence of the civil service, for example, now over dissolution affairs on the life of Parliament, and the idea that Parliament should be controlling them has come of age. So decisions to go to war, as in Iraq and in Syria, for example, have arisen. There is now, I think, a clear convention has emerged that before the government goes to war, there will be a resolution put to the House of Commons. David Cameron did this before bombing in Syria and lost the vote, and so we didn't proceed to bombing. So that really showed that there is now a constitutional rule, a convention, which will be complied with. So I think completing this, and I think that rule probably needs to be put into statute as well, completing it, codifying the prerogative, and moving towards a written constitution before too long. The Queen is now 90. We will before long be moving into a new era. I think it is really important to stabilise and be clear what the constitutional framework is surrounding the monarchy before the new reign. It is well known that Prince Charles is a more outspoken, a more opinionated individual, and it is in the nature of hereditary, or the hereditary quality of monarchy, that you have to put up with whatever personality comes to the throne. It's no good saying that that person must be like that, or have certain human qualities, they are like that or they aren't. Now, a monarch must ultimately comply with ministerial advice, and Edward VIII accepted the advice of his government that he had to abdicate, which shows, the full force of ministerial responsibility for the crown. And I've no doubt that Prince Charles, when he becomes king, will comply with ministerial responsibility in the same way. But I think there will be some fine-tuning around the conventions of constitutional monarchy. In my view, there are two aspects to this. There are the legal powers, which to my mind must remain completely depoliticised in the same way that they have been exercised by Queen Elizabeth. About impartiality and speaking your mind, it seems to me that there is greater scope perhaps for permitting a monarch or being interested in hearing what a monarch's views on public policy issues are, but in such a manner that they don't interfere or contradict government policy or perhaps prejudice or compromise diplomatic relations with other countries as well. So there will be some fine-tuning. We'll be moving into a new era, I think, with a new monarchy before long. Good. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Robert. That was a tour de force. I can't imagine anyone else being able to summarise the British Constitution and the role of the monarchy in British politics better than you have. So thank you for that, really. That was outstanding. I think I'll just take the recording, can it, and sell it, and we'll all become instantly wealthy. As Robert was saying, what we've tried to do today, in fact, is to look at two very different constitutions, or three very different systems, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the British. We decided not to look at the Swedish case, which I had originally asked Göran to look at, because as we've seen throughout the morning, the Swedish monarch really has been excluded from any effective political role, constitutional role, when it comes to government formation. And for the benefit really of those of you who aren't Spanish, I think that you've actually raised some very interesting questions, as is always the case when we look at things comparatively, because I think one of the reasons you were surprised at how political the role of the Spanish monarch is, and as you yourself rightly detected, this has a lot to do with the transitions of the legacies of the transition to democracy, but also an additional factor, which is if the monarch doesn't perform a constitutional political role, then what's it all about? Why do we need one? This is the question that a lot of Spaniards, I think, automatically ask themselves. And to some extent, the British, and actually also the Dutch and the Scandinavian answer is the symbolic dimension. And the problem there, as I will discuss tomorrow in my talk, is that Spain didn't have a monarchy between 1931 and 1975, and that seriously undermined and interrupted this potential symbolic role. And Spaniards, as a result of that, have been quite critical or dubious about the symbolic dimension. Going back to Herman's introduction, I think he underlined something which is extremely important, and that is when we're talking about democracy, we're normally basically talking about two levels. We're talking about the state and we're talking about society. And so far in this course, we have mainly dealt with the state dimension, how the monarch interacts with governments, with political parties, and so on. And I think for the future, we should perhaps think of the societal dimension, which you very rightly pointed out is probably going to be the next frontier. For example, when it comes to I think the more serious critiques of the monarchy as an institution, I think to my mind, the most serious critique is whether the existence of the monarchy is actually compatible with a meritocratic society. Whether it perhaps actually strengthens ideas of social deference, and in fact, therefore, to some extent, undermines principles of meritocracy. And I think this is it's a serious issue, because, of course, ironically, the more powerful the symbol is, perhaps the more powerful this non-meritocratic dimension becomes as well. And an aspect that nobody in Spain ever talks about, because we never talk about serious things, we prefer to talk about politicians and what they're up to in their spare time, is something that Herman mentioned, which is the ability of the monarchy to raise awareness of social issues. For example, Spain has become a nation of immigrants. About 10% of our population are now immigrants or people of foreign origin. Nobody ever argues that perhaps one role that the King and Queen should be performing is to highlight the challenges of social and societal integration with regard to the immigrants. Millions of people have acquired a Spanish passport. Millions of immigrants, mainly Latin Americans, have acquired a Spanish passport in the last 10 years. Spain received 5 million immigrants over a 10-year period. That's more than any other major country per capita in the world. In spite of that, we are fortunate not to have any xenophobic or racist political parties. We have been spared that. That may actually be an unintentional or unexpected positive consequence of 40 years of right-wing dictatorship under General Franco. But whatever the reasons, these people to some extent are waiting to be incorporated into Spanish society, and the monarchy could perform an extraordinary role simply by associating with immigrants more actively, by highlighting their problems and so on. But of course here we can come into conflict with what you were saying in your last few remarks. If the monarch underlines certain problems that exist in society, for example, with regard to the health system or the education system, obviously these are public policy decisions that rightfully belong in the political sphere, in the executive sphere, and there is a danger that the monarch will come into conflict with the government of the day. So I think in the 21st century we have to begin to talk about the monarchy in these perspectives as well, and not just our traditional political sort of statist approach. But I will shut up now. We don't have much time, and we are, as you know, we have an hour and a half this afternoon, so please don't feel frustrated if you can't pose a question now. But I think we have a few minutes very quickly. If there's anyone who is... please, yes. Can you again introduce yourselves? Feel free to ask your question. Feel free to ask your question in Spanish as well, if you like.
Okay, but it's fine to speak in English.
Thank you. That would make life easier for our speakers.
Vale. Bueno, soy Herman Rodríguez, soy del periódico El País y quería preguntarle al señor Herman Tjeenk un par de preguntas. Quería preguntarle si cree que este sistema...
Espera un momentito que estamos...
Sí, perdón.
Es el 1.
El 1 era la traducción.
Adelante. Adelante.
Sí. Quería preguntarle si cree que este sistema de formación de gobierno basado en la figura del informateur podría facilitar las dificultades que tiene España para formar un gobierno de coalición, y si ha sido preguntado por alguna autoridad española político para acerca de conseguir algo de consejo acerca de la situación política actual.
Feel free not to answer, Herman, if you don't want to.
No, the problem is that I know the situation in the Netherlands, but I don't know the exact situation in Spain. So don't ask me advice on the actual situation here. I can give food for thought. But I can't give any advice. And as I've pointed out, your situation is so different, historically, socially, politically, that you can't. You might compare, but you can't cope it. That's the only thing I can answer. Yeah. In the new situation in the Netherlands, the king will be informed regularly by at least the president of the assembly and the formateur and informateurs. Some formateurs are not so willing to do so, but anyway, this normal, because this at the end of the day, it's the king who has to assign and to nominate the ministers. So at a certain point in the whole procedure, you have to come from the parliamentary process into the more governmental process and the process where the king is involved. And therefore you have to inform the king so that he can really decide on with the good arguments. And he has to control, as I've pointed out in the first part of my speech, he has to control the procedure. Are the constitutional conventions, the constitutional rules followed? And then he has to sign. And the only exception is that he see that the procedure were not the right procedures, and then he has to ask the informateurs or the newly elected prime minister. How do you cope with that?
El señor ponente, como ves, no quiere ser mucho más específico al respecto, pero sí vale la pena quizás mencionar que la Casa Real ha sido informada de este precedente holandés por vías oficiales a través de la Embajada de Holanda, y nuestro ponente de hecho estuvo en Madrid a principios de año precisamente para dar a conocer este caso. Por lo tanto, la Casa Real ha mostrado interés por este mecanismo holandés, lógicamente, como él ha dicho, no con ánimo de copiarlo, porque no tendría sentido, pero sí como un elemento más que puede ayudar a Su Majestad a manejar la situación actual que no tiene precedentes, ¿no? Gracias. Profesor Laborda había pedido la palabra.
Sí. Bueno, felicidades a los dos ponentes. Y mi pregunta iría dirigida al profesor Blackburn y tiene que ver con una preocupación que me vuelve loco. Me dijo al profesor Blackburn, aprovechando el asunto del referéndum que ha supuesto que en principio el pueblo de Gran Bretaña ha rechazado seguir formando parte de la Unión Europea. Bien, yo creo que el resultado del referéndum crea un problema constitucional de primera magnitud. Pero claro, el problema de primera magnitud también me interesa conocer su opinión, porque acaba de señalar que ahora mismo Gran Bretaña está en un proceso de cambios constitucionales. Y el problema constitucional es que un referéndum, una consulta que tenía carácter no vinculante, no decisorio, va a condicionar a que el Parlamento británico acepte el resultado de ese referéndum. Por decirlo de una manera un poco humorística, Cameron ha conseguido lo que no logró Napoleón. Por lo tanto, mi pregunta es, para tener la base, que yo creo además que la Unión Europea, Europa, no tiene sentido sin Gran Bretaña. O sea, es que si Gran Bretaña se queda definitivamente fuera de Europa, Europa entra en crisis. Por lo tanto, mi pregunta es la siguiente. En este proceso de cambios constitucionales que quizás se vean, diríamos, acelerados por el hecho de que la reina de Inglaterra tiene 90 años y se abre un nuevo panorama histórico muy grande, los legisladores británicos, la opinión pública británica, los expertos, van a tener en cuenta esta dimensión europea que afectará indudablemente al futuro de Gran Bretaña? ¿O se va a quedar aislada el Reino Unido de la dimensión europea que tiene su propia crisis institucional? Gracias.
Well, I won't rehearse my own reasons for having voted to remain in the EU, but I'll try and answer your question otherwise. And the main one, I suppose, is that I think the monarchy has no relevance, I think, either way in this respect. And I think both ways. I don't think the existence of the monarchy or monarchy views affected how people voted, and I don't think us leaving the EU, if it really is going ahead, and as I've said before, it seems quite unreal that this is happening, will have any impact on our monarchy either. Although, to pick up the thread perhaps, and you implied this, I think, and I've said earlier on, I think this is one more reason why I think we are heading towards a written constitution. That will mean a complete legal overhauling of our constitutional law. And as I said, the Crown is the basis of our constitution. Now that will remain. Of course, you know, how you draft these documents is up to you, but it will be, you know, there shall continue to be a monarchy, there shall continue to be a parliament, etc. But I think you did ask about the process, again, and perhaps I'm repeating myself, but personally I don't like referendums, and if there are going to be referendums, I think they need to be in a written constitution as part of a legislative process. Now, it makes sense for a government to put forward a proposal, formulate it carefully, and then it to be rubber stamped, if you like, or put it to ratification to the electorate. That's not at all what happened in this case at all. It's a horrible process, and I think it's created the most terrible precedent for populist governments in the future as well. So you can have a government who wants to do something that it thinks is populist, but the legislature disagrees with, and saying, oh, well, I'll go over the head of Parliament and I'll just have a plebiscite on the matter. Everyone knows this was a political ruse of the Conservative leadership to try and outflank the backbench Conservative critics and UKIP, calculated on the basis that they would win. It's spectacularly backfired and has created a monumental problem, I think. But this, I'm being subjective and giving my own view here. I mean, it's remarkable that under David Cameron, for whom I have a great deal of respect, but he's held all these referendums. 3 referendums he's held, and they're not really part of our constitutional fabric at all. They've only ever been held for vested political purposes of one political party. You know, they started in the 1970s again, when the situation was exactly reversed. We have a Labour Party in power who was split on attitudes to Europe. The Conservatives were completely for Europe, but they agreed to hold a referendum and unite around the result, and the referendum supported the government, so all was well and good. But Cameron's held one on the devolution and on the voting system, which was a very unsatisfactory process. That was just part of the coalition agreement to keep the Liberal Democrats on side, but it wasn't really a proper referendum. We weren't allowed to vote on proportional representation. We said first past the post or the alternative vote, which is a majoritarian system as well, and everyone sort of said, well, what's the difference of that? I'll stick with what I prefer. And although I personally support proportional representation, particularly as the basis, the class and ideological basis of the 2 major parties is evaporating, I think it's important that all the parties are proportionally represented, but I didn't support the alternative vote, so I voted for the status quo, which isn't what I wanted at all. So that there is no system or scheme for referendums, and there needs to be one, and that also needs to be wrapped up in a process for constitutional law reform in a written constitution.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid time is up, so we will be back at 3:30, but let me again thank our wonderful speakers for their excellent contributions. Thank you.